Hello, everyone. Good morning, and thank you for coming to our session today. I know you're all pretty excited, and there was a lot of choice of really good sessions to attend right now. So we are really, really happy to see so many bright faces wanting to spend some time, an hour with us, talking about set and parameter actions. So it's going to be fun. We're going to have a really, really good time. But so you actually know who we are, I'll give you a quick presentation. So I'm here with Selçuk, one of my favorite co-speakers at Tableau, actually. We've been doing this a long time together. And Selçuk is one of the solutions consultants at Tableau, based on our London office. He actually is a specific type of consultant. He works with our global systems integrators. So a lot of his job is actually making Tableau part of a more global solution. Not just Tableau by itself, but Tableau as part of a more wholesome, holistic conversation. But Selçuk is a lot more than that as well. And I'm warning you because you might actually see him do this. Selçuk is a very keen photographer. He'll do anything to get the most candid picture he can, including dressing himself up as camouflage and try to pass for a Christmas tree. So if you see a Christmas tree at Data Night Out, that's probably what's happening.
Well, thank you, Ivan, for basically revealing my secret. Now everybody will know how I look, and I can't take funny pictures of people, but that's fine. Well, I need to return the favor, probably, and, well, he's also one of my favorite co-speakers, probably the most favorite co-speaker that I've worked with. And he's also based in London, in our London office, so we work together very closely. We're in the same team. And Ivan is looking after the Spanish and Portuguese market, because he speaks both languages, so multilingual person. You can go and ask him anything about food, bread, and basically anything good in life, like good life, any question that you want. Good places to go, good food to have, good restaurants. He is really good expert in that. But besides that, he's also a good, one of the favorite things he does is listening to music. He was one of the persons who was leading one of the marketing campaigns that we had last year in Europe called Party With Your Data. He's so much in love with that he has the t-shirt today, so you can see. And he's also the one who brings really positive mood in the office. When we have gloomy, rainy days in London, he basically does impromptu dance moves all the time and makes sure that everybody has fun. So this is us, and we are really happy to meet you as well. Today, we want to talk about set and parameter actions. And actually, we saw set and parameter actions for the first time 2 years ago. At that point, set and parameter actions were not even considered to be features in Tableau. They were just a hack by some developer in Tableau that thought that it's a cool feature. And we had a hackathon in London and tried for the first time set and parameter actions, and many of us solved a customer issue that we couldn't solve before using these features. And everybody was so much in love with them that we wanted the features to be released basically yesterday. So that's why we want to show you the power of set and parameter actions to you as well, and what you can do with them if you take them a little bit further and combine them with some Tableau features. And we will do that with some examples that we built for you. And we'll build some of the dashboards together with you so that you can see how they can be used easily. And by the end of this session, we're confident that you will understand when to use set and parameter actions and which one to choose in which situation. So the main purpose of this session is first to explain what they do and how they work, but second, and most importantly, to tell you why both of them exist and when to choose which. Then we also want you to be able to combine these features with what we already have in Tableau so that you can get the most out of them. And finally, set and parameter actions are really, really good for solving complex business questions that you may have day to day. So we want to show you how you can do that easily just by using these two new features. But before understanding how you can use them and when to use them, we need to understand first what sets and parameters are, because set and parameter actions will work based on the properties of these two features.
Perfect. So exactly like Selçuk said, what makes sets and parameter actions super powerful is actually based on the inherent properties of sets and parameters. So I know this is a Jedi session, and I know a lot of you will be familiar with these concepts, but this is extremely important. If you dominate the concepts that I'll explain now, you will immediately understand why sets and parameter actions are such a game changer. So that's why I'm going to review them together. So what are sets? Conceptually speaking, sets are just a way to dynamically group dimensions. They work as a Boolean, and this is really important. So the result of a set is always an in or out, which we can sort of think as a true or false. It has the same properties. It also has a fixed level of detail. And again, later on, we're going to see why this is so important. When you create a set, you always create it at a dimensional level. A set is fixed to that dimension. And every calculation or anything that affects that set will be calculated at that level, independent of what's on your view, independent of what level of detail you're working on in your dashboard. And then finally, they're fixed to the data source. So one set, one data source. It doesn't work across data source. And we'll see later that that's not the case for parameters. Okay, so this was very conceptual. So let's look at it in action. Let's start with a random dimension with 5 members called country. So we have 5 countries: France, Spain, Germany, UK, and Portugal. These are the members of the dimension. As you can see, we work in Europe, so we sort of always default to European countries. When we create a set of that country, we only have 2 members of that set, the ins and the outs. And every single member of the dimension country will be either in, or well, some countries are just really keen on being out. But that's, I know. But that is the key point. Everything will be either in or out. There's no third option. This is really important. So what about parameters? So parameters are a little bit more of is an easier feature to understand, because we've all been using it for a very long time. Parameters, in the end of the day, are just inputs that the end user can add that can then be used in calculations. They can be any data type. So different to sets, they're not necessarily bound to a dimensional level, to a string. They can literally be any data type. And they can be defined manually. That has been possible for years, but now they can be defined through an action. And also, and this is quite important, parameters work as their own data source. So a parameter, you can use one parameter to affect 2, 3, 5 data sources. It really doesn't matter. Also, this also means that to input into the parameter, it doesn't care. Whilst the set will require the same dimension to be inputted into the parameter, into the set, sorry, the parameter really doesn't care. All it wants is a data type. So looking at it more in a practical example, this is just a slider parameter that we're using to estimate different changes in our data, or we can allow the end user to just input certain values and define a change in salary. So this is an approximation of earnings over time. All of this is obviously fake data, but the idea is that that's exactly what parameters have always been there for, to allow end user interaction. So we've understood conceptually what they are. So let's talk about why these actions are so important. Why do they change the game so much?
Well, to understand how set and parameter actions are so fundamentally different, we first need to look at what our so-called legacy actions worked like. So if you think of filter, highlight, or URL action that existed in Tableau for a while, you may have an example where you want the user to select a specific mark. Let's say on a map, we select Brazil, and an action would apply based on that selection. And depending on what action you have created, a filter or a highlight, the respective action will apply to the targeted sheets on the dashboard. So this is how legacy actions work. When we talk about set and parameter actions, it's a little bit different. The user, again, selects a specific mark on the map, again, Brazil as an example. But what happens now is instead of triggering an action immediately, what we do is we store the value or the values of what the user has selected. So that's really, really important and also very powerful. So what do you do with the stored values now? Well, it actually depends on you, because you are the person who will design the action. So the action itself doesn't come out of the box like filter or highlight, but actually you can design your own action the way that you want. And that's what makes set and parameter actions so fundamentally powerful and different than our legacy actions. They're a game changer. They're like giving a painter a new color palette so that he or she can do new types of paintings that were not possible before. And with set and parameter actions, you will see that the interactivity and the expressiveness of your dashboards will increase tremendously, and you will be able to engage more end users to use the dashboards and to get more value of the analysis that you have done for them. So you have created a set or parameter action, but what are the things that you can actually do with them? What are the types of interactivity you can create?
Well, the best way to understand it is to actually see it. And I'm going to show you a dashboard, and I'm not going to tell you exactly which action I'm going to be using. I'm just going to tell you what's happening. This dashboard is looking at property transactions in London. And what you can see first visually on our map is actually the difference within that borough from the average transaction price. So you can see in red boroughs where tendentially property sales are above average price, and in blue, the exact opposite. And actually, we have that average price across all of London. Here, a little map that will show us our selections and a monthly trend showing us how the aggregate changes over time. But now, I'll just interact with this dashboard once, and I'm going to select a few boroughs. I'll select a few of the expensive ones. And you'll see things are changing. And a few things have changed here. With one single click, I've changed the color of the map. It's now no longer representing the average of the total, it's representing the average just from my selections. So I can compare amongst all other boroughs in London how they compare to my selection. I'm not filtering, I'm not highlighting, I'm creating a dynamic way of analyzing this data. I have the value, now the average for the boroughs that I'm talking about here. I have here the map showing me my selection. And then finally, I have a disaggregation of the trends. So I'm no longer looking at the aggregate level. Because I've selected things, it now decided to go up one level of detail, allowing me to much easier see what's happening with my data. So I didn't show you what actions were here. So which actions do you think I used to create this dashboard?
So if you think about what Ivan did, whether we use set or parameter action, well, actually, he used both. And he used them twice in different parts of the dashboard for the different actions that happen. And that's the point of this session, to understand when to use set actions and when to use parameter actions. And as we mentioned at the beginning, the reason why they behave differently is because of the inherent properties of sets and parameters themselves. That's why we have a few fundamental differences between set and parameter actions. The first one is that set actions generally work on dimension levels. So you use dimensions to create sets, whereas parameter actions can get as values anything in the data. So they work both with dimensions, but also with measures in the data. Second, set actions can store single results or multiple results, whereas parameter actions can store only a single result, and it can be aggregated, but at the end of the day, it will be just one value. Finally, set actions work only in the data source that they have been created, because sets work in the data source that they are created. Whereas parameter actions can work across multiple data sources. So that makes them powerful in some use cases. You will notice once you learn how to use them that set and parameter actions can actually be used interchangeably in many use cases. So because they store values at the end of the day, you can use either set or parameter action in many, many use cases, and that's why there is like a big overlap between the two. But one of them will always be easier to use. So we want to show you how you can get to the point to decide which one would be the better one to use.
Exactly. It's inherent on their properties. Because sets and parameter actions store that value, they will allow you to then construct calculations that achieve the same end result. But because of their inherent properties, one of them, as Selchuk said, will be easier or more performant. That's exactly the goal of this session. And so, this is by far the most important question that will help you understand whether to use one or the other. Do you want to store individual values, is the individuality of a member of a dimension important to your use case? Because if it is, then you're probably better off using a set. Well, on the other hand, if the end result is something like a measure, an aggregation, you just want to store that value to then reuse it in a benchmarking or in a comparison, then you're probably better off with a parameter action. But I want to show you a couple of use cases. They're use cases designed to take the complexity of the use case and focus on these concepts. Because when you understand these concepts, you'll then be able to build exactly what you need. Okay, so I want to start with a Pareto example. So in this example, I've just created Pareto charts showing me the percentage of customers for the percentage of sales. So I can see different, as I go right, I see the percent of customers. As I go up, I see the percent of sales. And this is divided as small multiples for all my individual product categories. This allows me to easily see shapes and overall patterns in the data. But if you want to actually go down to the level of detail and compare one to the other, up until today, you would have to actually input the value that you want to see. But with parameter actions, I actually can just go ahead and select in one of my categories, I can select a value, and that value will be propagated to all the other visits. Actually, so now I've selected 29% of all my customers. That has been propagated across all the other charts, but it also made the comparison with the percent of sales. So it actually allowed me to see that 29% of customers correspond to 56% of sales in telephones and communication, but only 38% in rubber bands. So in this case, it actually really doesn't matter which category we're talking about. The key point is that number, that value, that percent of customers. So how can I do this? Well, the first thing I need to actually create a parameter action is an actual parameter. But I actually can build it from the action itself. So I'm going to go up here to Worksheet, and I'm going to add a new action. I'm going to add this new parameter action to change a parameter. And I want this to take out the percent of customers. So that's first, it's the field that's going to go into my parameter. Then I'm going to select a new target parameter. You see I already have a lot of parameters in here, but I can just create a new one from here. And I call that Pareto field, and I'll call that percent of customers. I'll input that as 0. And when you're using parameter actions in general, I would recommend just keeping it at allowable values because you will be inputting it from somewhere else. So it really doesn't care if you're using a list or a range. Perfect, so I can now press OK. And now if I make that visible and I show my parameter control, you'll see it here on the right, the second one. If I select a value, it will update automatically that parameter. That's what's happening on the background. Nothing extremely exciting right now, but it means that I can now add a reference line, for example, for the percent of customers, and base that reference line based on my new Pareto build, percent of customers, label it as just a value, and now, exactly as we've seen in the viz before, I can just select one, and immediately that reference line is propagated automatically to all the others. Oh, well, it was just reference lines. That's not particularly exciting. It's a visual representation, but that is just meant to show you how you can start. So now I can go ahead and use the same parameter in a calculation. And I'll call this my Pareto reference of percent sales. And all I'm going to do here is I'm going to compare my Pareto percent of sales, and I want this to be bigger than the actual parameter. So Pareto build percent of customers. Let's make this a little bit smaller. And then I'm just going to ask this calculation to give me, in case this is true, to then give me the percent of customers. Oh, actually, I want here the customer, sorry. Pareto percent of customers, then give me the Pareto percent of sales. So this is giving me, from one comparison that's interactive, is giving me the other one. I'm going to create that, materialize, bring that into my view. And then what I can do now is actually reference that calculation. And now we're talking another level. We're not just talking about actually having Pareto reference of sales. I'll change that to a minimum so we can have the actual where it compares. And then I can just put the value here as well. So simple as that. What I've been able to build is that analytical, that interactive comparison, where one selection not only propagates the value, but it propagates as well the comparison because I use it in a calculation. So this is a case where I didn't want to keep the level of detail. I just wanted to keep the measure. What about if I do want to keep? So this is a sort of a very different use case where it's a new financial year and I need to select regions for my sales territories, and I want to do that in a data-driven way. I want to allow end users to play with the groupings so they can select different regions, in this case, different boroughs in London, and see how that affects the grouping. So this is actually a perfect use case for set actions, on the other hand, because in here, what I can actually do is I can select different boroughs in London. They'll be shown visually against all the others that are yet ungrouped. And I can select the other group as well. This just kept being populated. And not only can I see them visually, but I can use that to actually build the metric itself. I can aggregate this metric based on my different groups. So I can see here the average normalized prices of transactions for group A versus group B, or even the number of our sales. It's sort of completely dynamic benchmarking, where you're just selecting and grouping on the spot. So how can you build something like that? Well, as I said, set actions are a perfect use case for this because you want to keep that information about the identity. So you can just go ahead and use a set action. But set actions, you need to actually create the set before you build them. So let's do that here. To create our set, I'm just going to select a few boroughs, right-click, create my set. Doesn't matter what's in the boroughs now because we are gonna change them with the action. I'm gonna call this group A. I need to create another set for group B. So again, I'm just gonna right-click, create set, and call them group B. So we have our sets. Let's populate them with an action. I'm gonna go here to dashboard, action, and in this case, I'm gonna have to create two actions based on the last option of change set values. I'm gonna select my first sheet for group A, which just lists all the boroughs in London, and populate group A with it. And I'm gonna keep the set values and then click OK. And let's do exactly the same thing for the second one. And in this case, we want to affect group B. As you see here, it actually doesn't ask me what information I want to pass, whilst the parameter, if you remember, did ask me. This is because of what I was saying before. A set already knows what it expects. So you can't give it anything else when you perform the action. So now if I do a few selections here, a few selections there, my sets should actually have changed, but I can't see it visually. As you remember, we have just stored that information. We haven't done anything with it. So to do that, we just have to create a new calculation for it. I'm going to go into my map, create a calculated field, which I'm going to call that my market groupings, and use the set in a calculation. So this part is particularly important, which is how you use the set in a calculation. So sets, if you remember, work as booleans. So you don't need to make a comparison with anything. All you need to do is put the name of the set, and if the borough is in the set, it will be true. If it's not, it's false. So all you need to do is just write if group A, then A, else if group B, then B, and then else ungroup. This will give us our three groups. Again, remember, this is how you use a set in a calculation. For a lot of us, it's not really intuitive because we're used to using parameters and making this sort of comparisons. And now, if I put it in color, you'll see the ungroup goes to red, which is a bit too aggressive. Let's just change that to a gray. And now, as easy as that, without any sort of complex calculations or complex actions, we can easily change the members of one and the members of the other. There is one important thing, though, to take into consideration now, is that because of the way we built this, we now could potentially have the same borough in the two sets. So what we really want to do as well is use the inherent properties of sets to actually filter them out. So I'm now on the list for the group A, and I'm actually gonna select group B and add it to filters, select in, out, and just select what's not in the group B. Same thing for the second one, and you'll see in a minute why this is important. I'm gonna go to group B, bring up group A, so the other set, select in, out, and filter to just what's inside. What this means is that now the end user, if they select something from the first set, it will disappear on the second one. So if you notice, some of my selections are actually disappearing. So it is now impossible for me as an end user to actually have borrows on two different sets. So in the end, you've seen I haven't done anything extremely complex, but I was able to add this extra level of interactivity that the end user couldn't have before. And it doesn't stop there. You can have as many groups as you want. You can just go ahead, make 3 territories, look at sales in those 3 different territories, and dynamically allow the end user to play around with what's inside a set and outside a set. Okay, so that's, as we said, that's the main question in every use case. But there are others that are very, very important as well.
Okay, so we saw that with these 2 examples, when to use a parameter action and when to use a set action. And the main question was, do we want to aggregate the results into a single value, or do we want to keep the individual values separately? But there are a few other use cases where things get a little bit interesting. One of them is when you work across data sources. So a use case for that would be, let's say, if you have transactional database, and then you have an Excel file where you have the targets for individuals or regions, and you now want to use like an interactivity that passes values from one data, which is the Excel file, to the SQL transactional data, for example. And in that case, because set actions don't work across databases or data sources, you need to use a parameter action. Therefore, even before answering the question whether you want to keep the individual values or the aggregate values, the first question to ask is, do I work across data sources? Because if that's the case, then a parameter action is the way to go. Let me show you an example. So in this case, we are using the data that Ivan was showing about properties within London. But instead of looking only at the price, I want to be able to look at how different boroughs or different postcodes compare based on age, maybe distance to subway, like what is the average distance to a subway station, or number of restaurants in that area, so that you can have a multiple, like a 360 view understanding of the area and decide whether you want to invest there or buy a house. So in this case, what we want is also to provide a nice interactive use case to the end user. And instead of having drop-down menus or things like that, we want them to use actually buttons to drive the parameters and to see the results. Well, this doesn't drive. Or if they want to see the results on a different level than the one that has been selected for them, let's say instead of looking at the borough level, maybe the end user wants to go a little bit detailed and want to see the individual neighborhoods, they can just click on these icons or pictures and then drive the parameter or the values directly from there. So how do we do that? We don't have these options within the data set. The data set has just the data about transactions, about restaurants, etc. Well, basically what you can do in this case is create a different table which contains the values of what the buttons should pass as parameters. So in this case, we have 4 values about metrics and 3 values for the level of detail of the map. Let me show you how this can be done for the metrics, because it's exactly the same for the map values. So I will just create it in an Excel file, but in your case, it can be a database or view within your database that you want to store indefinitely and not on your PC. So let's call this metric, and it will contain 4 values. One of them will be the price. The other one will be the age. Then you will have restaurants. And then finally, distance to station. So I can save this table and use it as a connection, but because it's a simple table and we are just doing an ad hoc example, I'll just copy these values and open a new sheet and paste them. And Tableau will create a clipboard for me with the values that I have just created. It will be like as if saving the Excel and connecting to it. So now the next step is to create a parameter which can populate, which we can populate with these 4 values. So I'll just create a parameter and call it select a metric. And then, because these are text, I will just keep it empty and select string. And that's it, our parameter has been created. Let me show you, it's empty at the moment. Now what I want is to pass the values in the metric directly to the parameter. So I'll just create an action, which will be our parameter action. And because it works across data sources, I can say work everywhere in this workbook. Doesn't matter where I select it from, work from everywhere. Or you can specify a given dashboard. So depending on where you want this action to happen, you can basically select it from here. So I'll just select this one. And what we want is to create, to pass this sheet 48 to the parameter and work it from there. Let me just select it here. And what we want the parameter to do is to populate the metric parameter that we just created with the selection that we do. So I'll just pass the parameter and the metric from here, as you can see. And let's see how it works. So when I select a specific metric, as you can see, the parameter is automatically filled in with what I selected. So now I will add this sheet to the app, the decision-making app that we have created here. And we'll actually include the buttons instead of just the text. So if I just drag and drop the metric and create buttons from shapes that we have in our repository, then we can basically make this an interactive experience for the people. So I'll just assign them as correctly this. Let's get rid of the actual text. Okay. So we have our sheet, our buttons, and the next thing to do is basically to apply this in a calculation. Because as you remember, parameters are just idle if you don't use them in a calculation. So I will use the map because what we want to do is drive what has been selected on the map itself. So this will be, let's call it the selected metric calculation field. And let's write the calculation as a case statement. So this will be as a multiple if statement, but it's easier syntax to use. And we will call the parameter that we have just created. It's select a metric. Yes. So when the metric that we have selected is age, then we want to show the average age, basically. And when it is price, we basically want to show the average price. And you can continue with the other 2 metrics as well, just by writing the same things like when station, show me the station, when restaurants, show me the restaurant. But let's keep it simple for now, and I'll just keep it as it is. So let's click OK. So I will drag and drop this new field that I created into color, and we'll make sure that my parameter works on this view as well. So the one that will trigger the parameter is sheet 48, which we just created, but we can give a good name later on. And we want to pass the values that have been selected directly to this calculation. So when we select a specific parameter, it will immediately pass the values to that. And as you can see, that parameter, or the values for the parameter were created in a different data set, but I can still pass them through to my actual data so that I can see the results directly there. So it's a good use case when you have different data sources and you want still to pass values in an interactive manner. So that's the second question that needs to be answered. Like, are you working across data sources? But what is the next important thing?
So another key point to consider is that even if you want to store individual selections, if the viz level of detail is variable, then you'll be hard-pressed to not use set actions. And this boils down to what I was saying before. Set action is by default bound to, a set is bound to a specific dimension, so you can't easily navigate that if you're using a set action. So in this case, our recommendation is to actually use a parameter action whenever the viz level of detail might be variable. And a moment where that is very likely to happen, and that's actually where we ran into this use case particularly often, is when using dates. Because dates by default are something that you're always going to aggregate at a certain level. So you can either, and that's what I'm doing here, you can either make it visual and allow the end user to select date aggregations. Again, we're looking at property transactions, number of houses sold, and accumulated prices. But the aggregation by which we're seeing these measures can be easily changed by the end user. But even if the end user doesn't have this power, you can still have that even on your exploration stages. If you want to use a set action on a date, you have to, by default, define that in advance. You have to materialize that specific aggregation to allow the set action to work. So in these cases, yeah, it actually will be easier to use a parameter action. Okay, so let's leave it at the year level for now. When I'm looking at the number of houses sold, and I want to compare a period against the previous period, I can easily just select that date, and it would populate, because of the parameter, it will populate that year, but also the year before. Again, this will work as well if we're looking at the quarter level. If I select a quarter, it will not look at the year before, but it will actually look at the previous quarter as well. Let me just put this in automatic so it looks a little bit better. Yeah, that's better. So the period actually updates based on what we're talking about in the parameter. Okay, let's look at how we can build something like this. As I said, this is to give you an idea, because when we're talking about dynamic date comparison, parameter actions will really help allow the end user to select what they want to look like. So in the first thing, as we've established before, the first step of creating a parameter action is to actually have a parameter. So let's go ahead and go to dashboard actions here, and let's just build our parameter straight from here. This change parameter will come from our date selector, and we want to have our dynamic date aggregation, and we want it to affect a whole new parameter called build selected date. In this case, I'm just going to change the data type because I do want to save that date, and I'm going to leave it in all as well. Again, I don't really matter what I put here. I just want every value to be acceptable. So I'll click OK. As you've seen, I haven't added an aggregation. I just wanted to store that one unique value. So this parameter will actually now change as I select different values. But obviously, again, that doesn't really do anything that I can see. As we know, only after I create that behavior will I be able to see it. So let's start by just adding a reference line to our dynamic date aggregation. Let's give it a white line. And let's base, did I select white? Yeah. And let's base that on our build parameter. So as you can see, we've done something now. We've stored that value of that date. Let's use that now in a calculation to find the periods before and after. And that's very easy. I'm going to create a calculated field. I'm going to call that the select date minus one period. And again, all the calculations you're going to see today are very, very simple. It's the parameter in the set action that makes it interesting. Also, so I'm going to add to my selected date one period. And the period, so the date aggregation, is actually the initial parameter that's going to define that. So if it's a quarter, it will remove one quarter. If it's year, it will remove 1 year. And then here, I'm just going to add my build selected date. That's it. That just gives me the period before my selection. And let's go ahead and duplicate this and actually do the opposite. Edit this and add one period. Again, exact same calculation, but I want to add one period to find the end of my selection.
Plus.
Oh, sorry about that. Let me put that plus here. That will be enough for me. Now, I need to make sure I add these two calculations. We're no longer talking about parameters, so they're not global. We need to go and add them to the level of detail on my view. And I'm going to select both and just look at the exact date. So this will, as I said, bring one period in, one period down. Let's look at it visually. And actually now we could put a reference band here and start just by the minus to the plus and create this little band. And let's just take the labels as well, or that's going to look a bit funny. None. Cool. So now, if I go back to my dashboard, no matter what I select, that band will update. And not only will it update visually, but remember, I have actually stored these values. I can keep on using them in calculations. I could change the bands as well to reflect the different periods, as on the example before. But actually what I would like to do now is just see them visually here. And to do that, again, super simple calculation. I'm just going to call that my periods to compare. And again, just a very, very simple statement, which is if my actual date in my data is above my selected date minus one period, and the date is actually less than the parameter, so that's the build, then it's part of the period one. So very simply, I'm just comparing that with the result of my okay, copy that. Then the result of my parameter, and also I want to do exactly the opposite, where I want it to be bigger than my build and less than my current period. So select date plus one period. Current period, else just filter. And I'll show you why I use the third one. So the first thing I'm going to do is bring this new calculation into filter to exclude everything that's not within our selection. That's part number one. So now we've sort of materialized that filter action into the parameter action. We still get the same behavior with added behaviors. Now, the last thing is I want to add the periods to compare and add them to color. So now I can see my prior period and my current period. I could do a lot of calculations on top of this as well, but I really wanted to show you how this will allow you to do above and beyond what the traditional action will allow you to do, because those are materialized and are purely dynamic. So as you work through it, you're actually creating several behaviors. We have 3 different behaviors based on one unique click. And again, this is particularly exciting because it's all up to your imagination and your capability of building it. So we've looked at already 3 different questions. Is there anything else we should consider when using these features?
Well, similar to what we did with the data sources example, with the multiple data sources example, you can actually pass values using parameter actions outside of Tableau as well. And it's, again, a use case, maybe an edge use case, but very, very important for parameter actions. I work with consultancy companies who help a lot of enterprise customers doing planning and what-if analysis, and they want to make it visual and interactive for the end users, for the management, for presentation purposes. And one of the things that basically was very, very interesting use case was a financial planning dashboard. So obviously, this is a simplified version of that dashboard, but imagine the case where you have the values for your gross sales, the expenses that you have, etc., and calculations of your gross profit for the last 2 years, let's say, and you want to do scenario analysis for what would happen if my sales increase or my expenses decrease or increase in a certain way. So that could be done previously with parameters as well, but now using parameter actions, you can make it much, much more interactive, and also you can actually create new scenarios that didn't exist before. So let me show you how it works. At the moment, what we see here is just the gross sales and gross profit, the most important two metrics, compared with our expenses. And we have only 4 types of expenses: salary, rent, office supplies, and other. So everything besides the spark line and the labels that you see is historical data that actually happened. But the spark lines and the labels that show you the values are what we assume will happen in November 2019, because we still haven't had that month. So in this case, what we are looking at is the best case scenario. We assume that our sales will grow compared to previous period, and our expenses will not grow so much as before, because if you look at the expenses, they have been exploding. It's a growing business, so expenses grow as well. That reflects that our gross profit hasn't been changing a lot, although our sales have been growing in the past. So I want to be able to compare this best case scenario to other scenarios that we have created before. I have these scenarios hidden in a show and hide container. And as you can see, best case has been selected, and I can see what are the values that we are passing to Tableau from this best case scenario. Now, I also have a realistic scenario, and I can quickly check what happens if I pass the values for gross sales, office supplies, etc., that you see on the screen. As you can see, our profit dropped a little bit, and the change in the profit is now only 3% instead of 9%. And then we have a worst case scenario where our sales actually flatten, and then our expenses go up, and I can check what will happen in that case, and our profit, gross profit, will dramatically decrease with 16%. So this is how you would use like a single selection to pass multiple parameters to Tableau. But what if you want to create your own scenario that were not one of the pre-built ones? Well, for that, we have another application as well. So what you can do now is come up with your own scenario. You may say, I want to assume that my sales will grow dramatically, and maybe the office supplies or all these expenses will stay more or less constant. Maybe other expenses will drop because we don't have so much going on in November. And I will just assume that everything else is the same. Finally, we want to give a scenario name to this new scenario so that we can differentiate it. And I'll just call it TC scenario. And how do we pass this to the data? So this is how we pass these parameters, not within Tableau, but outside Tableau to a database as a write-back functionality. I'll just click on this new, this button, which basically tells me Save TC Scenario. So when I click that, that scenario will be saved to a database. In this case, we are using Google Sheet. It's just because it's accessible and free. And because we are using Tableau Desktop, I basically need to go and refresh the data. But if you're on Tableau Server, you just need to click a refresh button, and you will immediately see the results. So let me show you how we can refresh this data. Here we go. So this is my form, the Google Sheet form, where I wrote back the data that we talked about. And if I come back here and now look at my scenarios again, you will see that TC scenario now appears here in the list. And you can see exactly what values will be passed. I probably didn't click enter for the gross sale, that's why it's empty. But now I can pass these values and calculate what will be my gross profit in that case. So how did we do that? Well, basically, we used a Google form to populate all these parameters into by passing the values with a URL action. So if you look at this button here, it's actually having a URL action in the backend, which passes all these values to a Google form. So the URL action looks like this. It's just a URL that we got from internet, but if you're using a database, that would be a different process, but the idea would be the same, just passing the values back to the database. And if we test the link, it will take us to this URL action, and you can see that we have populated these values directly to a Google form. This Google form itself, if you have used Google Forms, has its own sheet in the backend where you can see how the data is being populated. So we have this financial planning scenarios sheet, and I can see all the scenarios that I have passed using this Google form with their corresponding names. So this is how I created this write back functionality. And finally, we use basically a parameter action to pass these values to the corresponding calculations once a selection is being done. And the actions are very similar to what we did before. You just need to create the action and then say how to trigger it just by selecting the corresponding scenario from this list. So I think we have a little bit of time just to show one trick which we think is very important.
Okay, so one of the things we haven't talked about is actually how sort of best ways to approach these problems. So I want to show you a little trick that will make it actually significantly more powerful to use set actions. So I'm actually going to go to one of the builds we've done today. And one of the things that you will notice is that when you're using a set action to populate the set, you will actually bump into Tableau's highlighting, trying to be helpful, and actually, well, being helpful and demonstrating what you have selected. But actually, set actions are a wonderful way to create your own type of highlighting and sort of bypassing Tableau's default. I'll show you what I mean. The first thing I'm going to do, I'm going to go to Group A, and I'll show you this in Group A, but it will be the same process for pretty much any set action that you build. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to create a simple calculation just with an empty string. So I'll call this highlight. It really doesn't matter. All it has to do is something that's exactly the same as a dimension that's exactly the same across all of the data. Oh, I already have a field called highlight. Let me just give you a little bit a star. Perfect. So I'll bring my highlight into detail here. And one of the things I'm also going to do is I'm going to bring my group A set, and I'm going to bring it into two places. So sets, a little bit differently than parameters, you can literally use them anywhere in the viz. So you can actually use them to sort the members. So I just added it to rows, and now I have a sorting of what's in my selection and what's not. I'll just hide that, and I'm also going to get the group A into color. This is just going to change shape a little bit. And as you see, I've now created a different highlighting where I'm highlighting actually the selection using color, not Tableau's default highlighting. If I now go into my group, my action dashboard, and I create a new action, in this case, a highlight action, a simple highlight action from select group A to select group A, focusing on the field that I've created. So this field is just allow me to make sure that I highlight everything. What this now means is that I can, when I select something, two things happening. The set makes sure that it's sorted by my selection, but also the color will change to indicate my selection. Again, various behaviors from one thing, and then the highlight action makes sure that Tableau's default highlighting, whilst being helpful, doesn't get in the way. So this is a little bit of a top trick that you surely should use when you're trying to create your own ways of highlighting what the end user has selected. Cool. So this is what we wanted to show you. I will just add something about our last question before we move on, is that passing values out of Tableau can be using write back, but that is just one example as well. This could be quite useful for things like custom SQL. where you actually define parameters of your query based on the selection of the end user. So think about what or even if you're passing them out to things like Python or R for advanced analytics. All these things, parameter actions will allow you to do in a very, very easy way. So finally, what did we learn today? If there's anything that I would like you to take from this session is this idea, that set and parameter actions, in the end of the day, they allow you to store end user selections in a way that's super visual and super interactive, intuitive for the end user. But what you do with it is up to your imagination, which is extremely powerful, which means that now the responsibility is on you to build exactly what you want to build. There's a really, really large intersection of use cases because of this nature of you build the behavior. There's a big intersection of use cases, but usually one of them will be easier to build or being more performative. This as well is quite important when we start to working with large volumes of data. This workflow is also designed to think about what is more performant to calculate and more performant to render. So that's what we wanted to show you today. There will be, if you are interested in this topic, there will be a few more sessions on this that we would recommend by some of our colleagues. So we do recommend you attend this if you're interested in delving deeper on these use cases.
And please don't forget to rate this session and give us feedback, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you would like us to improve, because this feedback is really important for us to make sure that we improve this session for the next time. This session has been delivered for the first time ever, and we want to make it even better for the next time. And if you have any questions, I'll be here around for the next 5-10 minutes, so we can have a chat. Just anything that you would like to know more about set and parameter actions. Thank you very much for being with us.